The city now faces a $9.1 million lawsuit after an officer arrested the man who had just saved a trapped child. That sentence spread across television screens, phone notifications, and radio stations across the country before most people even knew the names behind the story. To millions watching from their living rooms, it sounded almost impossible. How could the man who carried a child out of danger end the night in handcuffs instead of applause? But 47 minutes earlier, no one was talking about lawsuits or national headlines. The afternoon had started like any other day in the quiet neighborhood of Brookdale Heights, a middle-class community just outside Columbus, Ohio, where rows of maple trees lined the sidewalks, and the late spring air smelled faintly of cut grass and warm pavement. Around 4:30 that afternoon, the calm routine shattered when a sudden structural collapse inside a small maintenance building sent a wave of dust and confusion into the street. People stepped out of their homes. Someone shouted that a child was still inside. The building itself was nothing more than a storage structure used by a nearby daycare center. But part of the ceiling had dropped, blocking the narrow entryway and leaving a small space where a terrified voice could be heard calling for help. Parents gathered along the sidewalk. Some dialed emergency services. Others simply froze, unsure what to do as the seconds stretched longer and the cries from inside grew weaker with every passing moment. In the middle of that chaos stood Elijah Brooks, 34 years old, 6 feet tall, a maintenance contractor who had been working 2 blocks away that afternoon repairing a broken fence. Elijah was not wearing a uniform that made people listen. He had no badge, no official authority, no reason to be responsible for the situation unfolding in front of him. But when he heard the child's voice echoing from the dim opening beneath the broken beam, he did something simple and immediate. He stepped forward. A few people warned him to wait for firefighters. Another voice shouted that the structure might shift again. Elijah paused just long enough to look through the narrow opening where the child's small shoe was barely visible beneath a piece of fallen plywood. Then he lowered himself to the ground, braced his shoulders, and carefully crawled through the dusty gap. The air inside smelled like old wood and insulation. Sunlight slipped through a crack in the wall, casting thin lines across the floor where a little boy sat trembling beside a fallen storage rack. Noah Miller was 7 years old. His hands were shaking, his sneakers coated in gray dust. But when Elijah spoke calmly and told him everything was going to be okay, the boy nodded with the quiet trust children often give to strangers who sound steady. Outside, people held their breath. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, Elijah reappeared, backing carefully through the opening while holding the child securely against his chest. When the crowd realized the boy was safe, a ripple of relief spread across the sidewalk. Someone clapped. A mother cried with gratitude. For a brief moment, the scene felt like the ending of a story where courage arrives exactly when it is needed. But the moment didn't last. Because just as Elijah stepped fully into the afternoon sunlight, still holding Noah and asking if he was hurt anywhere, a patrol car rolled to a stop along the curb, and Officer Ryan Walker stepped out, scanning the crowd with a hard expression that suggested he believed the Rayall story was only beginning. Officer Ryan Walker stepped out of the patrol car with the slow confidence of someone who believed he already understood the situation before a single word had been spoken. The flashing lights from the cruiser painted the street in pulses of red and blue, while neighbors stood scattered along the sidewalk, still processing what they had just witnessed. Elijah Brooks remained near the edge of the broken doorway, gently setting Noah Miller onto the pavement as the boy's breathing finally began to calm. Dust clung to Elijah's jacket and streaked across his forearms, but his voice stayed steady as he asked the child simple questions that kept him focused. Are you hurt anywhere? Can you move your feet? Can you take a deep breath for me? Noah nodded, still shaken but safe, his small hand gripping Elijah's sleeve like an anchor. A woman's voice suddenly rose from the crowd. Sarah Miller pushed forward through the gathering neighbors, her face pale with fear that had only just begun to release its hold. When she saw her son standing beside Elijah, the tension in her shoulders broke all at once. She rushed forward and wrapped Noah in her arms, thanking Elijah in a breathless rush of relief that carried the fragile warmth of gratitude across the quiet street. For a moment the scene felt peaceful again. A child had been found. A mother had her son back. People began to speak all at once, explaining what had happened, pointing toward the collapsed structure, describing how Elijah had crawled inside when no one else could reach the opening. But Officer Walker did not look at the building first. He looked at Elijah. His eyes moved slowly across the dust on Elijah's clothes, the broken board leaning against the doorway, and the small crowd of witnesses speaking over each other with rising emotion. The officer's expression did not soften. Instead, it hardened into the careful distance of someone measuring a situation through suspicion rather than relief. He raised one hand to quiet the voices around him and stepped closer, his boots crunching lightly over scattered gravel near the curb. "Sir, I need you to step away from the child," he said in a firm voice that carried across the gathering without a hint of hesitation. Elijah blinked once, surprised by the tone more than the words. The boy was already safely in his mother's arms, so Elijah simply nodded and took a step back. No one argued at first. The officer continued walking forward, his gaze fixed on Elijah with an intensity that seemed strangely disconnected from what everyone else had just witnessed. One neighbor began explaining that Elijah had been the one who pulled Noah out. Another pointed toward the narrow opening in the wall. A third voice mentioned that the firefighters had only just been called and had not yet arrived. Walker listened for a few seconds, but the tension in his jaw did not change. Instead, he turned back toward Elijah with a short, direct question. "What exactly were you doing inside that structure?" The words landed in the air like a challenge rather than curiosity. Elijah answered calmly. "I heard the kid calling for help. The opening was small enough that I could reach him, so I went inside and brought him out." His tone was simple and respectful, the same quiet steadiness that had helped calm Noah only moments earlier. For a second the street fell silent again. Then Walker's radio crackled softly on his shoulder, filling the pause with static before fading away. The officer glanced briefly at the damaged building, then back at Elijah, as though the explanation had not settled the matter in his mind at all. Around them several phones had begun recording. Neighbors whispered to one another, unsure why the conversation felt suddenly heavier than it should have been. Sarah Miller was still kneeling beside her son, brushing dust from his hair while thanking Elijah again and again through trembling breaths. Yet despite the gratitude in the mother's voice and the clear relief on every face around them, the atmosphere shifted in a way that no one had expected. Because while the crowd saw the man who had just rescued a frightened child, Officer Ryan Walker appeared to see something else entirely, and the next words he spoke would turn a moment of relief into a moment that no one standing on that sidewalk would forget. Officer Ryan Walker took another slow step toward Elijah Brooks, the kind of step that made the quiet tension in the air grow heavier with each passing second. Around them, the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall maple trees lining Brookdale Heights, casting long shadows across the pavement where neighbors still stood watching. Some people held their phones at chest level, recording without fully realizing they were doing it. Others simply stared, confused by the direction the moment was beginning to take. Elijah remained calm, his breathing finally settling after the tight crawl inside the collapsed building. Dust still clung to his sleeves and the front of his shirt, and the faint smell of insulation hung in the air around him. He kept his hands visible and relaxed at his sides, not because anyone had asked him to, but because years of quiet experience had taught him that small gestures sometimes mattered more than explanations. Officer Walker stopped a few feet away and studied Elijah with a careful, assessing look that lingered longer than anyone expected. "You said you went inside to get the kid," he repeated slowly. Elijah nodded once. "Yes, sir. I heard him calling, and there was enough space to reach him. So I brought him out." The answer was direct and respectful, the same tone he had used with every person who had spoken to him since stepping out of the building. A murmur moved through the small crowd as several neighbors began speaking again at once. One man pointed toward the damaged doorway and explained that the boy had been trapped for at least several minutes before Elijah arrived. A woman standing near the curb added that Elijah had crawled through an opening barely 2 feet wide. Another voice mentioned that the entire thing had happened so fast that no one else had even thought about going inside. Yet as those explanations filled the air, Walker did not seem convinced by the chorus of witnesses surrounding him. Instead, he looked past them, his gaze drifting toward the narrow entrance where broken boards leaned against the cracked frame. The officer took a slow breath and then turned back to Elijah. "Did anyone give you permission to enter that structure?" he asked. The question caught several people off guard. Sarah Miller looked up from where she knelt beside her son, confusion crossing her face as she brushed dust from Noah's jacket. Permission, she echoed quietly, as if the word did not belong in the same moment as the rescue she had just witnessed. Elijah answered before the crowd could react further. No, sir, he said calmly. I just heard the child calling and went in. Noah Miller, still wrapped in his mother's arms, lifted his head and looked toward Elijah with the simple honesty only children carry. He helped me, the boy said softly. I was stuck and he pulled the board away so I could crawl out. The statement hung in the air with a clarity that no one expected to be questioned. A few people nodded immediately. Someone near the back said exactly out loud what others were thinking. That man just saved the kid. But Officer Walker's posture did not change. If anything, the lines in his face tightened slightly as he glanced once more at the broken doorway and then at Elijah's dusty clothes. Sometimes situations are not as simple as they appear, the officer said, his voice firm and measured. The words were not loud, but they carried the unmistakable tone of someone preparing to take control of a narrative that no longer matched the gratitude surrounding him. Elijah did not argue. He simply stood where he was, patient and steady, the same calm presence that had guided a frightened child out of a dark space only minutes earlier. Yet as the seconds stretched on, the quiet tension along the sidewalk deepened. Because the people gathered there were beginning to realize that the moment of relief they had just experienced was shifting into something else entirely, something colder and far less certain, and the direction it was moving in depended entirely on what Officer Ryan Walker decided to believe next. The quiet tension that had settled over the sidewalk now felt heavy enough that even the breeze moving through the maple trees seemed to slow. Officer Ryan Walker shifted his weight and looked directly at Elijah Brooks again, his expression firm and unyielding, as if the explanations offered by the crowd had not reached him at all. Around them, neighbors exchanged uncertain glances. Some continued recording with their phones while others simply watched, waiting for the moment to correct itself. After all, everyone there had seen what happened. Everyone had watched Elijah crawl into a dark, unstable space and come back out carrying a frightened 7-year-old boy. Yet the officer's tone suggested that the story in front of him was still incomplete. Walker raised his hand slightly, signaling the crowd to quiet down again. I need everyone to take a step back so I can sort this out, he said, his voice steady but unmistakably authoritative. A few people hesitated before moving a couple of feet away, though none of them seemed comfortable doing it. Elijah did exactly what was asked. He stepped back calmly, keeping his posture relaxed and his voice level when he spoke again. Sir, the child was trapped under that rack inside the building. I just moved the board enough so he could get out. That is all that happened. His explanation remained simple, the same straightforward description he had already given more than once. But Walker did not acknowledge the words immediately. Instead, he glanced again at the damaged doorway, then at the small crowd surrounding them, then finally back at Elijah as though measuring every detail of the moment against a different conclusion forming in his mind. You say you just happened to hear the kid calling and decided to go inside, Walker said slowly. Elijah nodded once. Yes, sir. That is correct. A neighbor standing near the mailbox spoke up again, unable to stay quiet any longer. We all saw it, officer. The man pulled that kid out. But Walker lifted his hand again without looking at the speaker. I will ask questions. When I need statements, he replied. The words did not carry anger, but they carried the unmistakable signal that he was now directing the situation. Sarah Miller shifted beside her son, confusion and concern crossing her face as she held Noah close to her side. She looked from Elijah to the officer as if trying to understand how the conversation had moved so far away from gratitude. Officer, she said carefully, that man helped my child. Noah was stuck in there, and he got him out. Walker gave a brief nod in her direction, acknowledging the statement without allowing it to settle the matter. Ma'am, I understand you are upset and relieved right now, he said, but I still need to determine exactly what happened here. The phrase hung in the air like a thin line dividing the moment into two completely different interpretations. On one side stood a man covered in dust who had acted when a child needed help. On the other side stood a uniformed officer who appeared to see unanswered questions instead of courage. Elijah sensed the shift before anyone else fully understood it. He had experienced moments like this before, moments where calm explanations were not enough to steer a situation back toward common sense. Still, he kept his voice respectful. I did not damage anything intentionally, sir, he said quietly. I only moved what I had to so the boy could crawl out. Walker's eyes narrowed slightly as he considered the words. Then he spoke again, this time with a firmness that made several people along the sidewalk fall silent all at once. Until I verify what actually took place, you need to remain right here, he said. Do not leave the area. A ripple of disbelief moved through the small crowd. Someone whispered that the man had just rescued a child. Another voice asked why he was being treated like a suspect. Yet Elijah did not protest. He simply nodded once and stayed where he was, standing calmly in the fading sunlight, while dust still clung to his clothes and the sound of distant sirens slowly approached from several blocks away. The moment stretched longer, the quiet growing heavier with each passing second, because everyone gathered on that sidewalk could now feel that the situation had crossed an invisible line, and whatever happened next would determine whether the truth they had witnessed would be recognized or questioned. The sound of distant sirens grew louder with every passing second, echoing down the quiet streets of Brookdale Heights, while the small crowd remained frozen in a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. Elijah Brooks stood exactly where Officer Ryan Walker had told him to remain, his posture steady and composed despite the shifting mood around him. Dust still marked his sleeves and the front of his shirt, small gray streaks left behind from the narrow crawl space where a frightened child had been trapped only minutes earlier. Across the sidewalk, Sarah Miller knelt beside her son Noah, brushing debris from his jacket while holding him close, her eyes still shining with the fragile relief that comes after fear finally loosens its grip. Yet that relief was now tangled with confusion as she looked toward the officer and then back at the man who had brought her child out of the darkness. Officer Walker spoke briefly into the radio clipped to his shoulder, his voice calm, but low enough that most of the words were lost beneath the hum of gathering voices and the approaching emergency vehicles. When he finished, he looked again at Elijah, studying him with the same careful scrutiny that had unsettled the crowd from the moment he arrived. Sir, I am going to need you to step over here toward the patrol car while we continue sorting this out, Walker said. The request sounded procedural, almost routine, yet it caused a ripple of tension among the neighbors standing nearby. One woman lowered her phone slightly and whispered to the man beside her that the situation made no sense. Another neighbor quietly repeated that everyone had seen Elijah bring the boy out safely. Elijah himself did not resist or question the instruction. He simply nodded once and walked the short distance across the pavement toward the parked cruiser, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots. His movements remained slow and deliberate, the same calm pace he had used when guiding Noah out from beneath the fallen boards. As he reached the front of the patrol car, he stopped and turned back toward the officer, waiting patiently. Officer Walker approached a moment later, his expression firm and professional, though the set of his shoulders suggested that the situation had already moved beyond the relief that had filled the street only minutes earlier. Around them, the crowd had grown slightly larger as more neighbors stepped outside after hearing the sirens. A fire engine turned the corner at the far end of the block, its lights reflecting across the windows of nearby houses. The scene should have been one of gratitude and reassurance, the kind of moment where a child's safety brings strangers together. Instead, a quiet unease had settled over the sidewalk. Sarah Miller finally rose from the curb with Noah beside her and walked a few steps closer, her voice careful but determined. Officer, that man saved my son, she said, her words carrying clearly through the still air. Noah looked up and nodded in agreement, his small voice following hers. He helped me get out. I could not move the board. Elijah did it. Several people murmured their support, repeating what they had witnessed. Yet Walker only acknowledged the statements with a brief nod before returning his attention to Elijah. Sir, until we confirm every detail, I need you to remain here with me, he said. His tone was controlled, but the implication was unmistakable. What had begun as a moment of courage had now shifted into something far more uncomfortable. The crowd felt it immediately. The cameras in several hands continued recording as the seconds stretched longer. Elijah stood quietly beside the patrol car, saying nothing, his calm presence unchanged even as the atmosphere around him grew heavier with uncertainty. And in that uneasy silence, the street of Brookdale Heights waited, because everyone there could sense that the situation had moved beyond simple misunderstanding and was now stepping into a moment that would soon reach far beyond the quiet neighborhood where it began. The fire engine rolled to a stop at the end of the block with a low mechanical hum, its lights reflecting across the quiet homes of Brookdale Heights, while firefighters stepped out and moved quickly toward the damaged structure. Their arrival should have brought a sense of closure to the moment, the kind of reassurance that tells a neighborhood the danger has passed. Instead, the tension along the sidewalk only deepened. Elijah Brooks remained beside the patrol car exactly where Officer Ryan Walker had directed him to stand, his hands relaxed at his sides and his posture calm despite the growing attention around him. Several neighbors continued recording with their phones, their quiet conversations drifting through the air like nervous echoes. One man spoke softly about how Elijah had crawled through an opening barely 2 feet wide. Another repeated that the child had been trapped long before emergency crews arrived. Yet the officer's focus never moved far from Elijah. Walker spoke briefly with one of the firefighters who had approached the collapsed building to inspect the damage. The firefighter listened, glanced toward the doorway, then back toward Elijah standing beside the cruiser. A few quiet words passed between them before the firefighter nodded and returned to his team. Across the street, Sarah Miller held Noah's hand while answering questions from another emergency responder who was checking to make sure the boy had not been injured. Noah looked back toward Elijah several times, his small face still marked by dust and lingering fear, yet there was trust in his eyes every time he spoke about the man who had helped him. He said Elijah moved the board and told him to crawl toward the light. He said Elijah stayed calm the entire time. Those simple details traveled quickly through the growing circle of neighbors and responders. Someone nearby mentioned that security cameras from the daycare building might have captured the entire rescue. Another neighbor pointed toward a house across the street that also had a camera mounted near the garage. The conversation was quiet but determined, as though the people gathered there understood that the truth of what had happened might soon depend on more than just their voices. Officer Walker returned to Elijah a moment later, his expression unchanged, though the presence of firefighters and paramedics had clearly shifted the atmosphere. The street no longer felt like a single officer managing a situation. Now it felt like a scene under observation. Walker paused beside the cruiser and looked directly at Elijah again. "Sir, I need to clarify a few things before anyone leaves this area," he said. Elijah nodded politely. "Of course, officer." Walker gestured toward the building. "You entered that structure without authorization and moved materials that could have affected the stability of the scene," he explained. Elijah listened without interrupting, though several neighbors exchanged shocked looks at the phrasing. From their perspective, the words sounded strangely disconnected from the urgency that had existed only minutes earlier when a child had been calling for help from inside the debris. Sarah Miller took a hesitant step forward again, her voice careful but steady. "Officer, if Elijah had not gone in there, my son would still be trapped," she said. The firefighter who had spoken with Walker earlier glanced briefly in their direction, as if considering the same thought. Yet Walker's response remained procedural. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," he replied. "But situations like this require proper assessment before anyone enters a potentially dangerous structure." His explanation sounded official, yet it did little to settle the uneasy mood around them. Because everyone present remembered how the moment had unfolded. They remembered the fear in the boy's voice. They remembered the narrow opening. And they remembered the man who had chosen to act while others were still deciding what to do. As the late afternoon light slowly softened across the street, the quiet neighborhood of Brookdale Heights began to realize that the rescue they had just witnessed was no longer the central story unfolding in front of them. Something else had taken its place, something that would soon travel far beyond the sidewalks where it began. The late afternoon sun had begun to sink lower over Brookdale Heights, stretching long golden shadows across the pavement, while the quiet residential street slowly filled with more people than it had seen all week. Firefighters continued examining the damaged building, carefully checking the beams and broken shelving inside the storage structure where Noah Miller had been trapped. Their calm movements made it clear that the immediate danger had already passed. The real tension now existed somewhere else entirely. Elijah Brooks still stood beside the patrol car exactly where Officer Ryan Walker had instructed him to remain. Dust clung to the fabric of his jacket, and the faint gray marks across his forearms had begun to dry under the warm air. He looked tired but steady, the kind of quiet steadiness that had carried him through the narrow crawl space only minutes earlier. Across the street, neighbors continued whispering to one another, their conversations growing more focused as pieces of the story began to line up in ways that no longer matched the suspicion hanging over the scene. Several phones were still raised, recording everything. One teenager stepped closer to show a firefighter the video he had captured earlier, the small screen glowing faintly as it replayed the moment Elijah emerged from the broken doorway carrying Noah safely in his arms. The firefighter watched for several seconds, his expression shifting slightly before he nodded and handed the phone back. Word of the video spread quickly through the gathered crowd. Another neighbor mentioned that her security camera faced directly toward the daycare building and would have captured the same moment from across the street. Someone else pointed toward the corner house where a doorbell camera blinked quietly above the porch. With every passing minute, the scattered fragments of the afternoon began connecting together into something clearer. Sarah Miller noticed it too. She stood with her son beside the curb, one arm around Noah's shoulders as he leaned against her side. The boy looked calmer now, though he kept glancing toward Elijah, as if still processing the strange turn the situation had taken. Sarah finally walked back toward the patrol car with determined steps, her voice carrying a steadiness that came from both gratitude and disbelief. "Officer Walker," she said, "several people recorded what happened. You can see Elijah helping Noah out of the building. He did exactly what he told you." Walker turned toward her, his posture still rigid though the crowd around him had begun speaking more confidently. "I will review any footage that is relevant to the investigation," he replied. The words sounded careful, measured, but they no longer carried the same certainty they had only moments earlier. One of the firefighters approached then, removing his gloves as he spoke quietly with the officer. The conversation was brief, but those standing nearby caught a few key phrases. The structure was stable enough for Elijah to enter. The board blocking the child had simply been lifted and moved aside. There was no indication that anything had been damaged beyond the initial collapse. Walker listened, his jaw tightening slightly as he absorbed the information. Across the sidewalk, the neighbors had grown noticeably quieter, watching the exchange with focused attention. Because by now the situation no longer looked like a mystery waiting to be solved. It looked like a story that had already been witnessed by dozens of people and captured by several cameras. Elijah himself remained silent beside the cruiser, his calm presence unchanged despite the shifting tide around him. He had not raised his voice once. He had not argued or protested. He had simply answered each question with the same quiet honesty he had offered from the beginning. As the sun dipped lower and the first evening shadows began to stretch across the neighborhood, something subtle but powerful started to change in the air. The uncertainty that had followed Elijah only minutes earlier was slowly dissolving. In its place, a different realization was forming among everyone gathered there. The truth of what happened inside that building was no longer a matter of opinion. It was a matter of record, and once those records reached beyond the quiet street of Brookdale Heights, the moment unfolding beside that patrol car would no longer belong only to the people standing there. The quiet street of Brookdale Heights no longer felt like the small neighborhood it had been an hour earlier. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, the soft orange light reflected across the fire engine, the patrol car, and the cluster of neighbors who had become witnesses to something much larger than a simple rescue. Word had already begun to travel beyond the sidewalks. A few people standing near the curb were no longer just recording for themselves. Their phones were uploading clips, sending messages, sharing the story in real time. In one video, Elijah Brooks could be seen emerging from the narrow doorway with Noah Miller in his arms, dust swirling in the afternoon light while the crowd gasped with relief. In another clip, the boy's voice could be heard clearly saying that Elijah had helped him crawl out. The footage was short, only a few seconds long, but its meaning was unmistakable. By the time Officer Ryan Walker finished speaking with the firefighter who had inspected the structure, the first messages had already reached local community groups and neighborhood social pages. People who were not even present had begun asking the same question that hung silently over the street. Why was the man who saved the child standing beside a patrol car like a suspect? Walker returned to Elijah with a slower step than before. The firmness that had defined his earlier posture now seemed less certain, as if the situation had begun slipping beyond the boundaries he expected to control. Elijah remained exactly where he had been the entire time, patient and composed, watching the scene unfold with the same quiet calm that had carried him through the rescue itself. Sarah Miller noticed the shift as well. She stood a few feet away with Noah beside her, one hand resting on her son's shoulder, while neighbors continued showing one another the videos on their phones. Several people approached the firefighters with the recordings, making sure they understood exactly what had happened inside the building. The responders watched carefully, nodding as the footage replayed again and again. The picture growing around them was becoming impossible to misunderstand. Walker stopped beside the patrol car and looked at Elijah for a moment before speaking. "Sir, it appears there may have been some confusion regarding the circumstances earlier," he said. His words were careful, measured, chosen with the awareness that dozens of cameras were now pointed in his direction. Elijah did not respond immediately. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accusation or triumph. The calmness in his expression seemed to disarm the moment even further. Across the sidewalk, several neighbors exhaled softly as though a tight pressure in the air had finally begun to loosen. The firefighters finished securing the damaged doorway, confirming that the board Elijah had moved was the only obstacle preventing Noah from crawling out. One of them approached Sarah Miller and assured her that her son was safe and that Elijah's actions had allowed them to avoid a far more complicated rescue. The words carried through the crowd with quiet authority. For the first time since the patrol car arrived, the focus of the street began shifting back toward the simple truth everyone had seen from the beginning. A man had heard a child calling for help. He had acted, and that decision had brought the boy back into his mother's arms. Yet something else had already begun moving beyond the neighborhood. The short videos recorded on those phones were continuing to spread from one screen to another, moving through social media, community forums, and message threads across the city. People who had never heard of Brookdale Heights were now watching the same moment unfold in grainy clips that showed a man covered in dust carrying a frightened child into the sunlight. And as those clips traveled farther, the question surrounding the scene beside that patrol car was beginning to travel with them, growing louder with every new pair of eyes that watched the story unfold. The quiet street of Brookdale Heights had changed in a way no one present would forget. The fire engine remained parked along the curb, its lights now dimmed as firefighters finished securing the damaged storage building. The late evening sky had shifted to a deep golden orange, casting long shadows across the sidewalks where neighbors still stood talking in small groups. The urgency that had filled the air earlier had faded, replaced by a different kind of energy. The kind that comes when a moment becomes larger than the place where it began. Elijah Brooks was no longer standing beside the patrol car. After the firefighter confirmed what the witnesses and videos had already shown, Officer Ryan Walker stepped back from the situation with noticeably less certainty than when he first arrived. The conversation that followed was quiet, almost careful, but those close enough to hear understood what it meant. Elijah was free to leave. Yet Elijah did not rush away. Instead, he walked slowly across the pavement towards Sarah Miller and her son Noah, who were standing near the curb beside several neighbors who had supported him throughout the tense hour. Noah looked up at him with the same trust that had been there when he crawled out of the dark space beneath the fallen boards. "Thank you for helping me," the boy said softly, his voice steady now. Elijah gave a small nod and smiled in a quiet, reassuring way. "I am glad you are safe," he replied. That simple exchange carried more weight than anything else that had happened that afternoon. Around them, the neighbors began clapping softly, a natural reaction that spread from one person to another until the entire sidewalk seemed to share the same quiet acknowledgment. Not loud celebration, but recognition. Recognition of the moment that had nearly been misunderstood. Across the street, someone lowered their phone after recording the final part of the scene. By then, the earlier clips had already traveled far beyond Brookdale Heights. The short videos showing Elijah emerging from the building with Noah in his arms were circulating through local news feeds and community pages across the city. Reporters had begun asking questions. Within hours, the story that started on a quiet neighborhood street would reach television stations and digital headlines across the country. Yet for Elijah, the attention did not seem to matter. He spoke briefly with the firefighters who thanked him for acting quickly when the child needed help. He listened politely as several neighbors introduced themselves and told him they had never seen anyone move so calmly under pressure. Through it all, he He remained the same steady presence he had been from the start. No raised voice. No anger. Just quiet dignity. As the emergency vehicles finally prepared to leave and the crowd slowly began returning to their homes, Sarah Miller watched Elijah walk toward the sidewalk at the edge of the block. The setting sun cast a soft glow across the pavement while Noah waved one last time. The moment felt simple again, almost peaceful, yet everyone who had witnessed it understood something important had taken place. Not just the rescue of a child, but the reminder that truth sometimes stands quietly in the middle of confusion and waits to be seen clearly. And long after the fire engine drove away and the street returned to its ordinary evening calm, the story from Brookdale Heights continued traveling outward through countless screens and conversations. Because sometimes the most powerful moment is not the act of heroism itself. It is the moment when the world finally recognizes it for what it truly was.